Good morning. Back there talking and enjoying the fellowship, and 9:30 snuck up on us. So I guess it's time to get started. This is the last lesson. Not sure why my voice is a little hoarse this morning. It must have been from eating too much. We'll go with that. All right, so let's take our Bibles and let's turn to the Gospel of Luke. This will be our last lesson in this examination, kind of a cursory examination, a survey, if you will, of Luke's Gospel. It's hard to take a Gospel and condense it down to 13 weeks, but it's certainly doable, and I hope that it has encouraged you to look into things a little more deeply. Today we're going to do much like we did with asking the question about the day of the week that Jesus was crucified, taking a little bit of a deep dive. We're going to do the same this week with a different subject. This time we're going to look at the trial of Jesus. And specifically, we're going to look at the trial before the great Sanhedrin. It was an illegal trial, and so we're going to do that. If you've got a handout, you'll see some extensive notes in that, and we'll get to those notes as we get about, I think, 7 or 8 slides into the lesson this morning. I hope it's been helpful. Hope it's been beneficial. I'm not sure what we're studying next time or even who's teaching it, but I understood that it was also going to be an examination of one of the Gospels. I'm just not sure which one. So let's continue on in Luke's convincing history. Why do we need an accurate history of the gospel? So we can understand it, absolutely. What else? What's that? So that we can believe and trust. What else? Evidence of things that happen, certainly. Fulfills prophecy. We see how that works, and it further bolsters our faith. What about someone ask you, why do you believe? Would this help you in that? I would hope so, because it not only convinces us for the sake of ourselves, but it convinces us so that we can in turn have rational discussions with people about our faith, about what we believe. Many people think that faith is merely superstition. That's one of the reasons I think that it's important to understand that Luke is offering something that is fact-based. He is an historical detective, as we observed in the first few lessons of this. And so he's examined this. He looked at this. He's a believer, but he's also talking to witnesses. And so he said, many people have written accounts of this. There are other gospels out there that are not contained in our Bibles. Some of them are simply not worth the paper they're written on. The Gospel of Judas, for instance. Others are merely detailed accounts or accurate accounts that are uninspired accounts. There are things that the Holy Spirit is guiding Luke in as he is writing this, so it's thoroughly investigated from a human perspective, and if you want to kind of put in modern terms, it's fact-checked as the Holy Spirit is guiding through there, so that we have this accurate account. But it's so that we can have certainty of events that we never saw and we never participated in. And so this orderly account that Luke has laid out for us begins with the announcement. This is what's going to happen. This is of a divine origin. We've tried asking ourselves all along, what does this say to the Gentile audience? Because this is a gospel for the Gentiles. Luke is the only Gentile who is authoring one of the 4 gospels in the scriptures. So it's a little bit different angle and includes many things that the others include, but it includes some things that are just there for Gentiles. So we see the whole story in Luke's gospel. And so you have the announcement of the coming of Christ, or the Son of Man, the appearance, the actual birth accounts you have his beginning of his public ministry, moving into that, and then he begins preparing his disciples for his death. What did we learn, if you've been in here all along, or if you're familiar with Luke, what did we learn about these disciples who were being told multiple times by Jesus, I am going to go to Jerusalem, I am going to die, and I am going to be raised on the third day, and then they act like they never heard it before? What do we learn in this narrative was going on with the disciples? It was veiled. It was veiled. Why would God veil this from the very men that needed to hear it? They would have tried to prevent it. They would have intervened in that. It's almost like the time traveler thing. You know, if you could go back in time and pop back into history and change something, it would change everything. And so they couldn't interfere. Did any of them try to interfere anyway? Who did? Peter. Absolutely. Pulls out a sword, whacks off Malchus's ear, and Jesus goes, no, we can't do this. We're not going to do this. And it was very confusing, I'm sure, to Peter as well as the others that this had occurred. But for that very reason, this had to unfold. It had to take place. Jesus was in control. God was in control every day, all the way through the end of this. This was, as Luke recorded in Acts chapter 2, according to the determined foreknowledge of God. And so it had to take place. And so we find all of this going here. And then Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem, and he follows that path. You can follow him around on a map, but he doesn't just secretly travel from point A to point B. He continues teaching. He passes through these towns, continues healing in all of these places, but every step of the way, he is very purposeful in what he does. And so he enters Jerusalem, the triumphal entry that we've looked at. We've seen the Last Supper that is there, but he makes prophecies while he is in Jerusalem about the future of Jerusalem, about the future destruction of Jerusalem, and the time of the end, as the prophet Daniel talked about it, the end of the Jewish system, the end of the Hebrew law, the end by the destruction of the temple, the end of sacrifice, the end of all of that. And in AD 70, all of that was fulfilled. Jesus nailed the law to the cross. It was a done deal at that point in time. But it was in AD 70 that everything was wiped out. The slate was wiped clean, and it was an ushering in of what the Bible refers to as the time of the Gentiles. We are living in the time of the Gentiles. And for the most part, maybe with some minor exceptions in this audience today, we're Gentiles. That doesn't mean that a Hebrew convert is any less than us. It doesn't mean that a Jewish person today cannot accept the same gospel that we did, that was preached throughout the New Testament here, and be joined together with Christ, be grafted back in, if you will, into the family of God and family of Christ. It doesn't mean that Jews are worthless people by any stretch of the imagination. It simply means that covenant is dead. It's gone. It's of no avail, and it cannot save. But the new covenant in Christ certainly can. That's why Luke said, I want you to have certainty of these things. So we looked at the Last Supper. Today, we're going to look at these last two areas, and that's the suffering, the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, the trials that he endured, specifically the trial before the great Sanhedrin, to see how this was an inside job. It was illegal and should not have turned out the way it did, but it did. And God knew that it would. And these people that have been trying to kill him, they've been plotting against him. They've been trying to find something that he preached, something that he taught, something that he said where they can make an accusation against him, but they simply could not. And their frustration is going to come out, and they're going to convict him and turn him over to the Romans to have him killed. The death of Jesus Christ is a united affair between Jew and Gentile. Mankind nailed Jesus to the cross. And in that sense, you nailed Jesus to the cross. I nailed Jesus to the cross. And seeing it that way is something that we can understand with the Gentile audience as they first read the Gospel of Luke, as they may have been in Asia Minor. Maybe they were over in parts of Europe, in Macedonia, in Corinth, wherever it was that the gospel was traveling to. They were separated by miles from Jerusalem, from these events. They were separated by years from these events. And yet they could have certainty that exactly what they're told, what they believe happened, is what happened. And that same thing is true for all of us. So that's where we get into this. So let's look in the Gospel of Luke, and let's pick up in chapter 22. And we're at the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, during which we have the time of Passover. That's where we had had some discussions about the day of the week that he was to die. But in verse 1 of chapter 22, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called the Passover, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. What is the connection? They were trying to put him to death, okay, we can kind of understand that. But why was it for they feared the people? What was their fear? They were losing their hold over them. They were losing control over them. John's gospel makes a very plain statement. It's like the whole world is going to go after him. All of our people are going to go after him. We're going to lose face with the Romans. We're going to lose our place with the Romans, and we're losing our people to Jesus. So the only recourse we have is to kill him. Was that the only recourse they had? It's the one they chose, certainly. You know, they could have done something extremely radical, like actually listen to his message, compare it to the scriptures, examine the prophecies of Messiah, and ask themselves that question: is this Messiah? But what it set in motion was something that continues to this very day, because today Hebrews are looking for the Messiah to come. And they're not looking for the second coming of Jesus, they're looking for the first coming of the Christ. And so they missed it then. It's perpetuated over the generations and over the centuries. But they had a choice. In fact, they could have submitted to him, and they could have led the people to Messiah. Why do you think that was not God's plan? Speculating here, why might that not have been God's plan? Richard? Right, and Richard is saying that it's the difference between a spiritual kingdom and a land kingdom, a physical kingdom. Jack?
Also had to fulfill the law, so that there's a blood sacrifice once and for all. That blood is what cleanses us. And without the death of Christ, we would have not had that ultimate sacrifice that fulfilled the law and gave us the spiritual kingdom.
That's right, because that law was put in place not as a distraction, but as God's ultimate plan for the redemption of mankind. And so Jesus fulfilled the law in every respect. And he didn't just wad it up and throw it away. He fulfilled it. And that is important to understand in the mission and the life of Jesus Christ. Everything was very purposeful, and it was ultimately to fulfill that. There's also an aspect of this that the people needed a strong break. Because if this had just continued on, as many thought, looking in the early days of the gospel, that it was merely a sect of the Jews. if it had continued on, these very men might have tried to take control over the new church and then bring it back into Judaism. In fact, the Judaizers tried that very thing, just in a little bit different recourse. But there had to be a clean, absolute break. One covenant dies, new covenant begins, and a transition to unify Jew and Gentile in one covenant was what God's plan always had been. And so there had to be this full break here. So the trials of Jesus Christ, there was a Jewish trial before the Sanhedrin. We're going to look at that here in just a moment. There was a Roman trial before Pilate. What was Pilate's verdict? Find no fault in him. He's innocent. And that was the official one. But as the Romans tend to do, ultimately that didn't matter because Pilate ordered him crucified. It's kind of an interesting examination of totalitarian dictates. He was simply making the best decision for Pilate instead of making a good decision as a trier of fact and having a fair outcome there. But there's one, this is my kind of stretching this just a little bit by calling it a Samaritan trial. Why would I call Herod the Samaritan trial? What do we know about him and his heritage? He had a Jewish lineage. Was he of the tribe of Judah? No. Did he have Gentile blood? Yes, he did. And so there was this mixing here. He represented the Hellenization of the Jewish world. His family was a blended family. It was not purely Jewish. He had no right to the throne of David. He was a puppet, a vassal king, if you will. But every aspect of the world judged Jesus, and they all judged him wrongly. Everybody had a shot at him. This was as thorough of a trying. If you're trying to put someone to death over the course of a night, which is essentially what happened, we got to hurry up and get this done before the Sabbath gets here. We've got to get rid of this guy right now, and you take him before everybody, and nobody's got a reason to put him to death. What should have happened? He should have been let go. But that's not what happened. I remember when I was younger and reading these stories, and you read the Bible much like you would read any other history, and that was that moment. I got very frustrated with Jesus because he didn't speak up for himself. Why didn't he speak up for himself? Jack?
Well, he didn't want to give, my opinion, he didn't want to give validity to anything they were charging him with. Plus, he could only speak the truth. He could prove them all wrong. He would have convicted them in their hearts of what they were saying. He could not argue with them. He had to remain silent.
That's right. And as a sheep before its shearer is silent, he uttered not a word. Fulfilling prophecy once again. So he allowed them to do what they were planning to do. No one takes my life from me. I lay it down willingly. That's what Jesus said in John chapter 10, foretelling what was about to happen to him. So he fulfilled his own prophecy in that respect because he didn't speak up to defend himself. And if he had, he could have refuted every word said against him. Even Pilate at this point goes, I find no fault in him. He's innocent. Well, let's look at this, what happened before the great Sanhedrin, and look at what's going on here and what transpired and why it was an abomination. It was a miscarriage of justice from top to bottom. It required the Hebrew leadership to violate the law of Moses in order to carry this out. Why is that symbolic or symptomatic of why this covenant had to die? Had the Jews ever broken the law of Moses before? Constantly. Yeah, they only broke it once, and it was 4,000 years. But it was. We read in the Old Testament time after time after time after time. And here at the moment, the Son of Man is looking them in the eye, and they are going to stand in judgment of him, is this moment that they break the law so completely, it shows that God's judgment of them is just. This isn't God being unfair to them. They had an opportunity here, and from top to bottom, they absolutely blew it. So if you look in your handout, there's not the PowerPoint, but there's a printout, several pages about the trial of Jesus before the great Sanhedrin. A system that is built on something called the law of Moses is something that is to govern them in all of their civil affairs, their personal affairs, their ritual affairs, the religious affairs. It governed every aspect of their lives. If you read in the book of Judges, where they were living under the law, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what? What was right in his own eyes. But that was the problem. There should never have been a king in Israel except for God. And every man should have done what was right in the eyes of God. And they should have governed themselves according to this law. But we find that the judges of Israel, people that would exist over time, they were comparing the actions that were happening on a daily basis with the law of Moses. It was to govern their civil affairs and their religious affairs completely. So having a high court was very natural. They had lower courts, but they had the high court, and it is called the Great Council. It's called the Council. It's called the Sanhedrin, which is smaller portions of it. Or as we're going to see today, the Great Sanhedrin, when all of them are together here. So this was about criminal law and courts and judges. And there was a lower tribunal. If you were doing something, you stole from your neighbor, anything like that. You could have 3 members. It was very political at this point. One chosen by each party, and then one that they mutually agree upon. So there's not a court that is like we have courts today and a courthouse to go to. You sit there and go, I want this person for me. You say you want this person for you. And then the two of us have to agree on that third person. It is to assure a fair outcome. And God was very good at what he did. The Jews, when they followed this, could have lived quiet and peaceable lives. They met under trees. They met at the city gate. They met wherever the need was to adjudicate what was going on in their lives. And if you read the law of Moses, it's got crazy things in there. What if I do something to you that results in the death of one of your animals? It's laid out in there what is to happen. And so you got to find out, did I cause the death of your animal? Well, I've got one of my guys in there. We've agreed on that other one, and you got one of your guys in there, and we talk about what happened, and then according to what was written, that's what we do. And so you had that going on. And so it took a simple majority to acquit, 2 out of 3, or to convict. And then the penalty was laid out in the law itself. Then what was called the minor Sanhedrin. You had 23 members, 7 priests, 7 scribes, 7 elders, and then 2 presiding officers. It could be in any town could convene the minor Sanhedrin. That any town that had 120 families, you could have this establishment there. They held court at the city gate. It was in the most public place. They invited everyone to be there to see everything take place, neighbor knowing neighbor, etc., so that justice was done. And how many times in the Old Testament do we find God through one of the prophets complaining because they did not fulfill justice? And it's in these settings and these determinations where it was at the core of Hebrew society. If they were going to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, they were going to live their lives according to this law. And whether that was the ritual sacrifices and the tabernacle or the temple, or whether that was in how they treated their neighbor, or a wayfaring stranger or anything else. The painful detail of the law of Moses is what was adjudicated here. And everything was covered, where there were applications to every circumstance, and then you had fair trials there. And there were two of the minor Sanhedrins in Jerusalem itself, which was the major city. And then there was the great Sanhedrin, and that's what we're going to be looking at here. 71 members. It was divided into a chamber of priests, a chamber of scribes, and a chamber of elders. Now remember, time and time again in the gospel, who do we find gathering to oppose Jesus? Well, there were priests and scribes and elders that were coming at him. And we find those terms recurring over and over and over because that's who led the Hebrew people. These are the ones that were making these decisions. And it was, like I said before, it had become very political because now you had to have representation by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they divided up this power, and there was a constant struggle there. In real terms, there was no difference between the way that they ran the Sanhedrin and all the politics of the temple and our modern processes in our House of Representatives, our Senate, or any other governmental body. Politics deteriorates into garbage. Pardon my personal opinion there. But when you get people involved in it, it messes everything up. And they were not immune to that. There were people seeking power, not seeking justice. And we see that unfold in the life of Jesus Christ. So you had 23 members of each chamber of priests, scribes, and elders, and then 2 presiding officers, 23 total for a quorum, a simple majority to acquit, 2/3 to convict, and then one of the most important points here, showing the beauty and the wisdom of God, a simultaneous uprising and condemnation of guilt and a unanimous verdict of guilt in that moment resulted in an acquittal. Why do you think that might be? If everybody just suddenly goes, he's guilty. And I don't know, making something up, maybe the high priest stood up and tore his robes. He's guilty. Why would that, in the eyes of God, turn into an acquittal? What is something like that showing? Conspiracy, prejudice, a lack of deliberation, in making a decision, a rash judgment in the heat of the moment. It doesn't mean that person's innocent. It means you need to be deliberative, that justice is the ultimate goal in God putting this in place. And so that is something that is very, very important. They believed that it lacked mercy. It was born of conspiracy, and it lacked deliberation. Was there a conspiracy against Jesus? Absolutely. Was there a foregone conclusion to what was about to happen to him? They had just been searching for the evidence for a long time. All right, so turn to next page and look at the court itself. And it's different than the way we do things. But there was no public or state prosecuting attorney. It was different than our courts. There was no special or secret accusatory body like a grand jury. The court could not originate the charges. The preliminary examination of the accused was not allowed. Everything had to be presented in the proceeding itself, and no court could consist of a single judge. It had to be the body. There were no lawyers for the defendant or for the plaintiff. Legally and morally qualified judges acted as defense counsel. Why would the judges be the defendant's advocate? What's that? They represented God. You want to give the fairest judgment. If you were on trial, would you want 71 people up there accusing you, or would you want 71 people up there whose primary goal was to find out the truth? And so you have the built-in safety net there unless the process is corrupted. Certainty of indictments were required before proceedings began. You may remember with Jesus, it was let's bring him in here and then we'll figure out what he's done that we can put him to death for. They were still seeking witnesses against him after the trial had begun, and that is completely illegal. Judges were required to carefully consider the merits. The high priest could not uncover his head or tear his clothes. We find that happening with Jesus. Who else do we find that happening with? Stephen tore his clothes. What did they do? They all rose in a simultaneous verdict. This man's guilty. Take him outside. Stone him to death. They violated these same precepts and procedures with the first Christian martyr as well as with Christ himself. That was why the Jewish system needed to die. It needed to end. It was corrupted from top to bottom over many generations and many centuries. The youngest judge voted first, and then they voted in ascending order of age, so that the younger judge wouldn't be unduly swayed by the wise older judge. There was training that went in all of this, and your mentor likely was older than you. And if you're kind of trying to figure out what's going on and you're kind of straddling the fence, you're not really sure the way you want to go, and your mentor votes a certain way, it is likely to sway you in that same direction. So built into this is youngest to oldest, so that would not occur and they would vote through there. And again, the simultaneous unanimous verdict had the effect of an acquittal. The court could not convene before the morning sacrifice or after the evening sacrifice. When was Jesus tried before the Sanhedrin? At night. It was illegal from the very beginning there. They must convene, not in the house or the chamber of the high priest, for instance, but in the hall of hewn stones in the temple, aside from the temple courts. Trials were public, they were during daylight, and they were not held on the day preceding a Sabbath or a holy day. Oops. Do y'all see how thoroughly this was an abomination of justice on behalf of Jesus? And no conviction of death could be concluded in one day. They concluded this trial in a matter of a couple of hours. And so it was thoroughly corrupt. All right, turn to the next page there where it says the defendant and the witnesses. And I want you to just know go back through what you already know about what happened with Jesus in the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. The defendant had an absolute right to trial and the right to appeal up to the great Sanhedrin. So if you meet at the city gate, you go through the lower court. Or if you go up to the minor Sanhedrin, you had the natural appeal process all the way up to the great Sanhedrin. This one began with the great Sanhedrin. Jesus had no appeal available to him. The accused was presumed to be innocent. What did they already think? What did the priests, the scribes, and the elders already think about Jesus? He's guilty. We need to put this man to death. They started out with a verdict and then crafted a trial around it. No uncorroborated confession could be used against defendants to convict defendants. They were talking about what he said. And in fact, they had so badly misunderstood it. What were some of the accusations against him? This man said he's going to destroy the temple. Did he say that? Yes. In the way that they presented it? No. The destruction of the temple, the destruction of the law, took place in a very spiritual way. Again, the law was nailed to the cross And yet it was Jesus' body nailed to the cross. How is that possible? Jesus is the Word of God. The law of Moses is the Word of God. And so as Jesus was nailed to the cross, the law was nailed to the cross. He didn't take a scroll. The Romans didn't grab a scroll and nail it to the cross. It was in the body of Jesus Christ. But it was spiritual in that sense. The witnesses, they were not under oath. The witnesses acted as prosecutors. Remember, the Sanhedrin, the court, acted as defense counsel. The witnesses were the ones that had to make the case, and they gave testimony separately and in the presence of the accused. None of that occurred with Jesus. Testimony witnesses required to agree in all essential details. What do we learn from the Gospels about the seeking of witnesses against him on this night of his trial? They couldn't agree. The witnesses did not agree, but they proceeded with the trial anyway. They were seeking false witnesses against him, but the witnesses could not agree of what these charges were. This is one of my favorite ones. False testimony made the witness subject to the crime charged against the defendant. Kind of would make a witness think very long and hard about offering false testimony. Because whatever the crime you're alleging, the penalty for that crime would be, if this guy's acquitted, you now have to pay that price. God's pretty good at what he does. He knows human nature. He created us, and he knows how people are. So if you come to me and say, hey, we need you to be a false witness against this guy, I'm like, not me. You have to find somebody else. Because I don't want to suffer that fate. I don't want to suffer that penalty there. Accomplices could not give testimony. Special committee held private examination of witnesses before allowing the testimony. In other words, they pre-interviewed these guys and then brought them in to hear what they had to say, but they didn't even allow testimony that seemed outrageous. So they would kind of filter it, and it had to be legitimate charges that could be brought against this guy, but it was not the Sanhedrin that did this. All right, so Joseph Caiaphas was the high priest, and he was the president of the Sanhedrin. His father-in-law, Annas, was a former high priest. They really didn't get along, but they were actually in business together. They owned a large estate outside Jerusalem. They raised turtle doves. What are turtle doves for in Jerusalem? Sacrifice for who? For the poor. So if you're poor and you're commanded by the law to travel to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice, and because of your economic status, you are required to offer a sacrifice of a turtle dove, and you come into the temple complex, but you're coming from another region that has another currency there, you're forced to convert your currency to the local currency, the temple currency, and you had money changers. So you get ripped off on the exchange rate, and then you have to buy a turtle dove from the high priest who's making money off of your turtle doves. Does that instill confidence in you? It is just a corrupt system top to bottom. And yet that God had told them to take care of the poor. To be careful what you're doing and how you're doing it. And yet this corrupt system allowed this to occur from the top down. Here, the family had turned the temple complex into a den of thieves. That's precisely what they were. It was a money-making system for all of it. And Sanhedrin members were disqualified if they had a financial interest in the outcome of a trial. What had Jesus done right before this trial? Cleaned the temple, turned over the tables of the money changers, drove out all of these people that were doing this. Wow, that clock must be broken. This time has flown by. All right, So the Hebrew leaders spent the week trying to trap him. What authority? What's the greatest commandment? What about the resurrection? Is it lawful to pay taxes? And Jesus not only silenced them and answered, but then he went on to woe are the scribes, woe are the Pharisees, hypocrites. Judas betrayed Jesus for the price of a common slave. Jesus was arrested probably shortly after midnight, but it was night. They went to the Mount of Olives. Jesus was praying there for a long period of time. They came and arrested him after midnight. He was taken before Annas for a private examination. Remember the relationship between Annas and Caiaphas? So this examination was done by the out-of-office high priest, who's the father-in-law to the actual high priest. And so that's when he was struck by the soldiers, etc. So he was sent to Caiaphas, to the great Sanhedrin. And the reason we know that is Mark 14:53 says, all of the chief priests, scribes, and elders. That is the description of the great Sanhedrin. This was all of them that were there. They were supposed to hear charges. They were not supposed to originate charges. They were supposed to stand as advocates for the accused. And yet they were the ones who were acting as prosecutors in this case. They drummed up the charges against him. They brought in men trying to get them to offer their false testimony against him. And trials only begin when witnesses whose testimony agreed in every detail were ready to present the case. These witnesses had to come in, but you just don't allow anybody to come in there. You've got to make sure that this is a legitimate charge against somebody. And they could not agree there. And these false witnesses and interrogation by the court continued until they sent him to Pilate. All right, so let's go to the last page there, and just a listing there of 13 parts of this, that the descriptions that we have in the Gospels of the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin are violated. It was an illegal arrest. It was arranged by an accomplice, a co-conspirator. He was one of Jesus' disciples, and yet he was the one that was also the traitor there. It was not from a legal mandate of the court. An illegal examination by Annas, private preliminary examinations are not allowed. Illegal night proceeding, it violated the specific and inflexible Hebrew law. Could not be after the evening sacrifice, could not be before the morning sacrifice, but they did this anyway. It was in an illegal location. It was not held in the temple complex in the Hall of Hewn Stones. It was held in Caiaphas' palace. And so they dragged him there in the middle of the night. It was an illegal indictment. It required certainty and agreement of witnesses. It was an illegal indictment on the charge of blasphemy. It was made by Caiaphas. If you remember, he said, "What more do we need? That man has just blasphemed." He originated the charge in the middle of the trial. And none of the witnesses were making that charge. It was supposed to be completed and brought before them, and Caiaphas was supposed to be acting on Jesus' behalf, not as a prosecutor. The personal conduct of him, he tore his clothes. It is for the same reason that you voted from the youngest member to the oldest. If the high priest of Israel stands up in the middle of the proceedings and tears his clothes, what do you think his opinion is? And he has just influenced everybody. And so this was something that could not happen. He had to maintain decorum. He had to maintain his dignity. But he was so frustrated because they could not prove their case against Jesus that he stood up and tore his clothes. Same with Stephen, when he said, "You stiff-necked people, you killed the prophets, and now you've killed the Son of God." It was an illegal vote. It was a simultaneous guilty verdict instead of going from the youngest to the oldest. The vote was unanimous. as well as simultaneous. It was this man's deserving of death, and that the way that transpired should have freed Jesus. He should have been let go. Should have acted as an acquittal. Illegal testimony. They used uncorroborated testimony of Jesus himself. You have to have witnesses to what is there. He cannot testify against himself. It was illegal time, illegal conviction, and it was an illegal day because it was on the day preceding a Sabbath or a holy day. And then Mark 14:64 said, they all condemned him and rendered him worthy of death. Every aspect of that was illegal. It was the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of jurisprudence. Why? Why did it work out that way? It was God's plan. Why did it have to be so thoroughly corrupt? Because that system was corrupted, not by God, but by mankind. The book of Hebrews says that this old system, the old covenant, the law, was done away with not because God broke the covenant, but because they broke the covenant. And now Jesus is the mediator of a new and a better covenant that is ushered in on better promises. So all of this not only was to affect the death sentence against Jesus, and they handed him over to Pilate, who says, I find no wrong. Here, you got your choice, Barabbas or Jesus. They all said Barabbas, crucify him, and Pilate goes, okay, I'll wash my hands of it, kill him. It was corrupt, it was unjust, and you have the only sinless human being who ever lived is delivered to die because everybody in the world, the mixed race of Herod, the Gentile race of the Romans, the pure race of the Hebrews, all conspired to put him to death and nail him to the cross. Humanity is guilty of the death of Jesus Christ. We all are guilty of that, and it had to happen that way. For the Gentiles who read this, they had to understand that they were complicit in the death of Jesus Christ, just as surely as the Hebrews did, just as surely as we, a couple thousand years later, need to be assured that we're responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. All right, I appreciate you guys' attendance. Jimmy, you have a comment?
Last time that humanity had degraded to that point, God wiped them all out.
Yes.
This time, he had a different plan.
He had a different plan. He redeemed us when we were irredeemable. And it shows the loving kindness of God. It shows the determined foreknowledge of God that he had this plan from the time before the creation of the universe. All right, any other closing thoughts or comments? All right, thank you all. We'll see you here shortly in our time of worship together.